Hi everyone, my name is Matt, and welcome to my channel. The new edition of Age of Sigmar is right around the corner, and I can't think of a better way to mark the occasion than by painting a Skaven Verminlord. So grab your brushes and let's get started. I began by spraying the model with a grey primer, followed by a coat of white from the top and sides. The result is a subtle, zenithal style coat with grey on the underside, blending to white on the top. Alternatively, you could undercoat the model with white or a light grey and get great results too. You'll also notice I didn't glue the model to the base. With the base glued on, it'll be difficult to paint some of the areas near the bottom of the model, and not to mention difficult to film. The downside to not having a base on the model is I have to be pretty careful where I hold it, and I want to make sure I don't touch any of the wet paint. I'm going to start off with a kind of odd mix for the skin. I mixed equal parts Darkoath flesh, contrast medium, and Stormvermin fur. The result is a grayish brown color that I think will make a nice base coat for the skin. Apply this just like any other contrast paint. Work on one section at a time and put down a generous layer of paint. Then use the brush to soak up any excess. Some pooling is good because it helps create shading, but I don't want too much of the paint to pool in the recesses. Otherwise it can drip and it'll take forever to dry. Some of the sections are large, so just do your best to work fast. The skin is dry now, and I'd like to add some shading, along with a little reddish tone. For that I'll be using Targor Rage Shade. Just like the last layer, I want it to pool a little bit, but not too much, so I'll use the brush to soak up any extra paint. After the shade dried, I wanted to deepen a few of the shadows, so I painted another layer. Rather than paint this layer all over, I painted it directly into some of the folds and the undersides of the muscles. I want to add some more color to the skin, especially the end of the tail, and Magos purple will work really well for that. I want to have a blended effect in the center of this section, so I started off by painting one side with purple. Then I rinsed the brush, wiped it on a paper towel, and then used the clean brush to blend out the edge. I repeated the same blending process on the other section and the back sides. The very end of the tail won't need a blended effect, so I painted the whole thing. I also used Magos purple to add some color around these markings on the skin, and I built up a few layers of paint to deepen the color. After the Magos purple dried, I added one more layer on the end portion of the tail. I want the armor to be a real dark green, and I made a mix of equal parts Black Templar and Aeldari Emerald. If you saw my last Tyranid video, I used a similar mix on the scales, and I thought that would look great for Skaven armor, and it'll contrast really well against the other colors too. I worked on one section at a time, and made sure the paint didn't pool too much. I'm not worried if some of the paint gets on the trim or on the hair, since those will get an opaque base coat later. I just want to make sure that I don't get any on the skin. Spillover is going to be unavoidable in some areas anyway, like on his back here. Some hair is overlapping the belt, and there's not really any easy way to access it. After that first layer dried, I painted a second to deepen the color. Next I base coated all the hair with Stormvermin fur. You may want to paint a second coat for an even finish. Then I painted all the fur with Black Templar. There are a lot of tough to reach places in the fur, especially on the back. I think it's best to take your time and focus on being as thorough and as neat as possible. One thing to watch out for is if you're painting the ends of the hair too fast, sometimes the brush can flick small drops of paint on the rest of the model, so it's especially important to work slow and watch out for that. There are a few areas where I painted a blended effect, and I did that the same way as the tail earlier. Just rinse the brush, wipe it on a paper towel, and then use the clean brush to blend out the edge. Next I moved on to the cloth. I want a real dark red-violet color for the cloth, and I made a really nice violet by mixing Sigvald Burgundy with black Templar, about equal parts. Now that some of the other colors are painted, the green armor is looking a little too bright for me, so I decided to shade it with a layer of Nuln Oil. I want to add some rust to the armor next, and it's going to be easier to do it now before I paint all the trim. I thinned down Mournfang brown with some water, and with very little paint on the brush, I built up some thin layers on the armor. I think it's easy to overdo rust, so I try to put on less at first. I can always go back and add more if I want to. I think it'll be easier to paint the horns next, so first I touched up any mistakes with a light gray. This is the lightest shade in my custom grayscale, which you can learn to mix here. Or if you don't feel like mixing anything, white is pretty close. I want the horns to have a blended effect, and Mortarion Grime shade paint will provide a nice base layer. I don't want the paint to pool or drip, so I'm making sure to soak up any excess with the brush. For the next layer on the horns, I mixed equal parts Mortarion Grime and Stormvermin Fur. I find it easier to turn the model upside down for this part, since I want the horns to be darker on the ends. I painted the mix about 3/4 of the way up the horn, and then rinsed the brush, wiped it on a paper towel, and blended out the edge. The larger horns I did a little differently. I painted a small amount and blended the edge first. Then I filled in the rest of the horn. Just like with the last layer, try to avoid excessive pooling. I think it's better to get a smooth coat, even if it's a little spotty. I can always paint a second coat if I need to. Now's a great time for me to ask you to do those YouTube things that we all love so much. If you're liking the video so far, please give it a like. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future content. If you really like what I'm doing here and want to support the channel further, consider being a channel member. We have some perks including a Discord server and early access to videos. Next I repeated the same process with Nuln Oil, working my way a little further down the horns. After it dried, I painted a few more layers of Nuln Oil, working progressively smaller areas towards the ends of the horns. Since there will be a few layers, it's even more important to make sure the paint is smooth and even, and avoid pooling. Next I thinned down some black paint with a small amount of water and painted a black line around any unpainted details, around the edges of the armor where it meets up against the skin, around the claws, and I also painted the strings on the horns. Now for the metal areas. I began by base coating the steel with Iron Hand steel. After the first coat was dry, I applied a second for a smooth, even finish. Then I shaded the steel with an equal parts mix of Nuln Oil and Agrax Earthshade. You could paint the shade all over if you want, like I'm doing on these spikes. But in the case of this big throwing star, I'll be taking a different approach that's a little more time consuming, but I think it looks a lot better. I like to build up the shade in a few layers, and make each face have its own gradation. I like to think about how the light is hitting the model, but there's also a lot left to the painter's discretion. If there's a really dark section, I'll try to make the adjacent section bright in order to make it more visually interesting. Next I moved on to the brass, and I base coated all of those areas with Runelord brass. This has got to be the most time consuming part of the model, and especially the armor on his back underneath the hair. Just take your time and try to be as neat as possible. Next I shaded the brass with Darkoath flesh. I want to add some oxidation to the brass, and some turquoise paint will work really well. I thinned it with water, about equal parts, or maybe slightly more. Then, with very little paint on the brush, I added some to the armor in a few areas. The paint will look a lot brighter while it's wet, and it'll darken and get more dull as it dries. You can see it darkening in real time here as it's drying. It can be really easy to overdo this effect, so I recommend working in thin layers and build up the color gradually. You can always add more if you want to. There's some poison on the throwing star, and Moot green will work well for it. I thinned it down quite a bit and painted a glaze on the blade side. Then I grabbed some undiluted paint for the rest of the drips. We'll leave that for now. I'll focus on highlighting and shading it later in the video. I painted the hooves, nails, teeth, and all the spikes along the tail with Zandri dust. Then I shaded them with an equal parts mix of Agrax Earthshade and Nuln Oil. Now that all the base coats and shades are done, I decided to glue the model to the base. I don't want to handle it too much once I start highlighting. For the first highlights I want to tackle the skin. Rakarth flesh is a really close match to how our contrast mix looks, so I'm going to start out by glazing some of the larger areas. I'm mostly concerned with smoothing out any uneven areas. The tail has a gradation, and I want the highlights to change color as well. So I'm starting off with Rakarth flesh until the base looks too pink, and then gradually fade the highlights out. Then I mixed some pink into the Rakarth flesh, and picked up the highlights where I left off. and then I added more pink for the last section. I also used the pink mix to highlight the edges of the cuts on his skin. I'm going to highlight the skin one more time, but I want to do it selectively. I used Pallid Witch flesh and picked out some of the sharpest edges, focusing on what I think are the more interesting sections of the model. I don't want to highlight the same amount everywhere. It would be way too much work, and it wouldn't look as striking. I also mixed some pink into the Pallid Witch flesh and added a few tiny highlights on the end of the tail. Next I moved on to the fabric, and I highlighted the edges with Screamer Pink. I want to add some scratches to the fabric, so I thinned down the Screamer Pink with some water into a glaze-like consistency. With barely any paint on the brush, I made a few lines in random directions. Sometimes I like to make some more scratches on top after the first layer dries. I want the next highlight to be lighter and cooler, and mixing in some Fenrisian Grey makes a nice lavender color. I mixed about equal parts Fenrisian Grey and Screamer Pink. Then I picked out some of the top edges and corners, and I highlighted a few of the scratches from earlier too. Next I highlighted the edges of the armor with Sybarite green. This is a pretty big step up in value compared to the base layers, so I want to make sure that the lines are narrow and precise. I also don't want to overdo the highlights. I think a little can go a long way, so I'm focusing the highlights on any areas that look particularly interesting. With some slightly thinned Stormhost silver, I carefully picked out the edges of all the steel areas, and I added a few scratches too. I generally like to add more scratches on the lighter side as a way of highlighting it, and I'll put fewer scratches in the shadow side. Then I highlighted all the brass with Canoptek alloy. Just like with the steel, I added some scratches as well. Some of the larger areas got highlights on the edges, but most of the brass trim just got a few scratches here and there. I like the blended effect on the horns, and I want to carry that effect into the highlights. I'll work on this one horn from start to finish, and beginning with Zandri dust. I want the top to stay really dark, but I'd also like to get a bright highlight on the very end of it. So I worked my way down the horn, highlighting the edges. The horn is gradually getting lighter as I work around, and eventually the Zandri dust will kind of blend in, and that's the point where I can stop. Moving on to the next highlight with Bonewhite. I picked out the top corner again, going a little closer to the top. Then I picked out some of the very corners along the ridge. Eventually, about halfway down, I could start making larger highlights. And just like with the last layer, eventually there's a spot where the horn gets lighter and the Bonewhite won't really show up anymore. And that's where I can stop and move on to the next color. For the final highlight I used Offwhite. I painted some on the very end of the horn, and then moved about halfway down, starting with a few spots along the ridge. Then I was able to paint some larger highlights near the base of the horn. After painting the horns, I used the same 3 colors to highlight the claws and the tail spikes. I highlighted the strings and leather with Dryad bark. And then I picked out the edges with Steel Legion Drab. Next, I highlighted all the fur with Stormvermin fur. Rather than highlight each strand of hair, I'm focusing on clumps and large areas as a whole. Some sections will get more of a highlight than others, and some not at all. I mixed equal parts Warp Lightning and Contrast Medium, and I painted over the poison on the throwing star. I cleaned off my brush and blended out the top portion. I want the eyes to have a glowing kind of effect, and I'll start off by using some of that Warp Lightning mix and paint it directly into the eye sockets. Then I set it aside to dry. Now for some brighter green. I mixed equal parts Moot green and Toxic yellow, and I painted the eyes with it. Then I thinned it slightly and added a few highlights around the eye. Finally, I painted the center of the eye with pure white. I attached a few pieces of cork tile to the base with superglue. Then I used an old brush to apply textured paste. While the paste was still wet, I sprinkled on some coarse gravel and fine sand. After the base dried, I painted over all the dirt with Rhinox hide. Then I dry brushed the base with Steel Legion Drab. I painted the rocks with Dawnstone, shaded them with a mix of Nuln Oil and Agrax Earthshade, dry brushed with Dawnstone, and then dry brushed with a mix of Dawnstone and Bonewhite. I painted the edge of the base black, and when that was dry, I applied patches of brown static grass with superglue. I've got to say I really love Skaven. They were my first army for Warhammer Fantasy, way back when 6th edition was king. I even remember a few Skaven-themed school art projects. I've painted a lot of Skaven over the years, but I always painted them red. I thought I'd try something new here with green and purple, and I'm really glad I did. I think it turned out pretty cool. When was the last time you tried something new in the hobby? Have you considered changing up the color scheme on your long-collected army? Drop a comment below and share your thoughts. I'd like to give a big shout out to our new channel members. Thank you so much for your support, and I can't wait to put it to good use. If you want to be like these amazing people and help support what I'm doing here, just click the join button down below, and thank you. Don't forget to join our Discord and share your hobby photos too. Well, that's it for now. Thanks for watching, and until next time, happy painting.